Serious, people who have found human remains, murder scenes, or other suspicious scenes. What happened? When I was 11, my dad and I stayed the night over at his dad, my grandpa's house, one night. My grandpa had just gotten out of the hospital for something relatively minor, so that's probably why we were there. Anyway, I woke up around 4 a.m. to go use the bathroom, and I noticed that there was a body in the tub. I woke my dad up, and told him several times until he understood what I was saying, and then he ran to the bathroom, and bent over the tub. I listened as my dad made some guttural animalistic moaning sounds that were the most terrifying thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I understood that my grandpa was dead, he shot himself, but I hadn't learned about suicide yet. I thought that there was a murderer in the house, and that he was going to kill us next. It's been over 20 years, but I can still tell you the episode of Fairly Odd Parents I watched before going to bed, and the nightmare I had immediately before waking up that night. Edit: the episode was the one where they go to the skate park. Hex Games. Edit 2, why didn't the gunshot wake you up? Because, as it was explained when I asked that question, we can usually sleep through a single loud noise. It's repetitive sounds that drag us awake like an alarm or a baby crying. Also, I probably did wake up from the sound, and the urge to pee is what kept me from drifting right back off. The police seem to think that he shot himself right before I found him. I was visiting my grandfather one summer day in Hoboken, New Jersey back in the late 50s, and went for a walk along the piers jutting into the Hudson River, and found the body of a dead man floating in the water near Holland America Lines Pier A. I flagged down a police car. He was a Hudson County police officer. I showed him the body. He used a police phone box on a telephone pole, and told me to leave. I slipped back in, hid behind a stack of pallets, and about 3 more cops came, and a fire chief. Then a hook and ladder came, and a fire van with a rowboat on roof racks. Before they could launch the boat, a New York City police boat arrived, and they pulled the body from the river. He had swollen up, had a chain wrapped around him, and it had an automobile rim attached to it. The firemen lowered bolt cutters to the cops with a rope, and the cops cut the chain. The firemen lowered a Stokes basket, and the cops put the body in it. The firemen pulled it up, and laid the man on the dock. Then they pulled up the chain and rim. One guy with a badge on his belt took photos of the man. An ambulance came, and they loaded the body onto the stretcher, then into the ambulance, and it left. A cop put the chain and rim in the trunk of a police car. Then everyone left. That September my teacher gave us an assignment, how I spent my summer, and I wrote about the dead man. She gave me a B, and wrote great imagination. I was a chef for a while, and lots of people come and go. One place I worked had a basement. There was an office, storage, walk-in fridges, and freezers, time clock, bathroom. It was cool in the summer. Good place to take a quick break. During a dinner rush, one of my guys ran down to use the bathroom. We were busy, so you don't exactly go unnoticed when you're not there. 5 minutes go by. Then 10. Where the fuck is he? The first thought that comes to mind. Pooping. You don't poop during dinner. Rule 1. Second thought, he left. That's common during rushes. Everyone has their breaking point. We've had people just walk out. Not this guy though. So I ran down when there was a little lull, when the dining room is full, and all the orders come in at the same time, and people don't leave the tables. You can have a line of 20 people waiting for tables, and just the way it flows, you're not cooking anything. Everybody's fed until a table opens up and the new people order. I go check. Door to the bathroom is locked. Not responding to knocks. Banging away. Fuck. I know what it is before we even get it open. He OD'd. That was a terrible night. I thought he was getting clean. He had a baby at home. Drugs suck. I used to manage a hotel. I once walked into a room that was supposed to have checked out, and found a man who had hung himself presumably the night before. I obviously called the police, made sure the cleaning staff did not go in that room, and gave a statement once the police got there. Hotels are so busy, and this all took so long that I didn't have time to react or dwell on it until the end of my shift. I parked my car, and started to get out, and just puked in the parking lot, and began sobbing. It was bizarre. I asked for the next day off, and my boss, being the asshole she was, refused, saying it wouldn't be fair to set the precedent. Back in college, I woke up to a text from my housemate saying I'm going to kill myself. I pounded at his bedroom door, frantically calculating in my head the amount of time I'd have to bring him to the hospital if he had slit his wrists or overdosed. No response, so I ran downstairs to try and get the key to his room. Ended up seeing his body hanging outside the living room window. He had jumped out the window from his room on the second floor with the noose tied to the curtain rod. Realized I was far too late, because his body was already stiff, and showed signs of rigor mortis. Took 3 hours before his body was cut down. Before that I'd been planning to surprise him with a vacation to his dream destination since he'd fallen on hard times. I couldn't look out of windows for months, and I've been drinking heavily ever since. Watching suicide/hanging scenes in TV shows/movies makes me literally sweat buckets. There's still a lot of lingering PTSD, and it remains the worst moment of my life. My buddy and I were out for a trail run in the local state park when we came across a guy who hung himself. Called the cops, we were interviewed, and sent on our way. The guy's car was nearby, filled with newspapers. He was a paper delivery guy. Was in a McDonald's drive-thru after work around 1 a.m., I was 19. Random homeless guy with a beer in his hand walks between my car and the McDonald's, and says, "Hey, there's a house on fire over there." He was muttering some other stuff, so I didn't really take his word for it. He was out of it. Drove down a neighboring street, and saw smoke pouring out of a house. The roof was making popping noises, but I banged on the door and windows trying to see if anyone was inside. Ended up having to stay and write a witness report as they pulled the homeowner out onto the grass in front of me. They performed CPR for 5 to 10 minutes, and the officer ended up telling me the man died. Really fucked with me at the time. Found a dead guy on my way to work. Middle of a cold winter, maybe early/mid-January in Manchester. There's a lot of old mill buildings that are used as offices, stores, pubs, etc. I was walking to work, having parked a bit far from the entrance, and I saw what I thought from a distance was 2 trash bags. As I got closer I realized it was a person, didn't think much about it, moved on. About halfway to work I realized there was no steam from breathing. I got concerned, walked back, and started loudly speaking at the person, who was non-responsive. I went into work, and called 911 because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't own a cell phone at the time, this was early 2Ks. Dispatcher said some people were on the way. I went down to the closest spot, and waved in a cop then an ambulance. Said I was the person who called, lead them to the guy, asked if I could go, they determined he was dead, and I went to work. I'm guessing he froze to death, not sure how he got there. He might have been homeless. I didn't get a great look at him outside of telling you adult male with dark hair. Told the cop where I worked if they needed me, and went to work. My dad found a human skull in a gravel pit. Called the cops, they came and got it, never heard anything else. I was a dumb kid at the time. So when he told me about it, I assumed we were going to solve a mystery. Turns out reality is way more boring. Back in the pre-cell phone days, I found a body on my way to work. My starting time was 5 a.m., and I would occasionally bike to work, weather permitting. It was to be a warm day, so off I go on my bike. No traffic meant I could cruise along pretty good. I was just starting to enter an underpass when I spotted a person laying on the road. I'm thinking a drunk fell off the sidewalk, and passed out. As I slowed down I saw a long trail of blood. So off the bike I go to see if they were okay. Half-opened eyes, and brain matter said otherwise. No phone, and no traffic, what to do? First car to come along was a taxi. Great, he has a radio, and will call the cops. Wrong. He sees me jumping up and down, waving my arms near a down person. Hits the brakes, pulls a fast U-turn, and got the fuck out of there. A couple of minutes later a van comes from the other way. He does the same thing. Then a car pulls up, an older dude asks what's up. I tell that's a dead person, and someone needs to call the cops. He says he's got to get to work, and will probably phone from there, and left. About 10 minutes later, I was able to flag down a police car about a block away. An ambulance shows up at the same time. I ask them, the cops, and EMTs, if anyone called them. Nope. So I get interviewed, tell my story, and I'm sent on my way. Later in the week, an officer calls me to let me know what was happening. Apparently it was a suicide. She, 23 years old, was having a rough spell, and was living on the streets. Her family said she was harming herself since she was a child, and had attempted to kill herself before. Jumped off the overpass onto the pavement below. Pretty sad situation all around. And as it turned out, I worked with her cousin about a year later. I've never talked about this before, and I'm glad I did, even if it was on Reddit. Last year my mom and I came back to her and my stepdad's house. We were getting the rest of the birthday supplies we had hid because we were throwing my stepdad a surprise birthday party. My mom was letting the dogs out while I was making my way upstairs to get the rest of the supplies, and my stepdad wasn't supposed to be at the house. He was in the dark stairwell, and I was confused on why he was there, so I said, "Excuse me, I left something upstairs, and I need to get by you." When I tried to go around him, that's when I noticed he was swinging freely, and I knew right away. I grabbed the knife out of my pocket, and cut him down. It was too late, he already released himself, but I still did CPR, and my mom heard the loud thud, and she came running in, and calls 911. He took his life because he was hearing voices in his head telling him to do very unpleasant things to his family. So some may say he took the coward's way out, but I believe he made the ultimate sacrifice to save his family from himself, and the demons inside. I close my eyes when I have to walk up the stairs. If I don't, I still see him hanging there. Still something that stays with me to this day. Not suspicious, but I felt like the facility got away with negligent homicide. I worked with a new patient. I do physical therapy. She had a new hip replacement. She was young, less than 60. She complained of significant pain in her thigh, and was unable to do much physical therapy that day. I had asked her questions about the pain, and given the amount of time that had passed from her surgery, she was still at risk for blood clots in her legs. I had asked her if she talked to the nurse or doctor about the pain, and she said she had. I noted her pain, and spoke with nursing, saying that it is possible that she had a clot, and they brushed it off as her not wanting to do therapy, and was a difficult patient. I came in the next morning, early, before patients were awake, and one of the staff stopped me, and told me that she had passed overnight. She was still in the room. I was not supposed to, but I went in, and held her hand, and told her I was sorry that I didn't push more to have her checked out. Since then I have been vocal about exactly what patients should be demanding if they have complaints that are unanswered, and make sure I document my conversations with staff clearly if a wrongful death suit would be filed. Edit. Thank you all for the support. It was pretty traumatic, and weighs on my mind, especially after the loss of my dad and grandfather to medical mistakes. All I can say is be an advocate for yourself, and for your loved ones. I know a lot of us are polite, and don't want to be that person, but the simple fact is people know their bodies. If they are insisting something isn't right, they probably know better than you. Difficult patients, drug seekers, or just people with low thresholds for pain/discomfort shouldn't just be written off or ignored. I know this is a hard thing to do, but if possible, be present when your loved ones are in the hospital or skilled nursing. You will be able to catch things that would slip through the cracks otherwise. When I was 12, I was cycling next to the river in my little village when a fisherman found a suitcase. Being a nosy kid, I went to have a look as he opened it. It's hard to describe the gunk I saw inside. You certainly wouldn't have known it was a person, but bones were visible. The police came, and did an investigation. Later found out it was the body of a 70-year-old man from a neighboring county who had disappeared a month before he had been murdered by his son, chopped up, and placed into several suitcases. Only the one was found, and it was nearly 50 miles away from where they had been dumped. Can't say it affected me at all, probably would now. So my dad's previous house had a small forest in between it, and a very sketchy neighborhood. We used to explore it as kids. One day, we found a fridge in the middle of the forest, nowhere near any trails or roads. It was kinda old, but definitely hadn't been there for long. It had chains wrapped around it, and a padlock. We told our dad about it, and brought him back to it. He confirmed with us that the fridge was just screaming sketchiness, so he contacted the police. The next morning, some cops showed up, and he took them into the woods to show them the fridge, except it was gone. Apparently they could clearly see marks left by a hand truck or something that hauled it out to the closest trail, and then the road. Nothing much they could do about it, just said to not go back there. The creepiest part is just that it disappeared after less than 12 hours, and only a short walk from our house. So someone could have known we'd found it, or we just missed them moving it. Whatever was in that fridge, they didn't want anyone finding out. Former leasing agent, walked into a studio apartment to find the tenant had screwed a heavy-duty ceiling hook into a 2x4, laid it so the hook was hanging through the grating on some metal shelving, wrapped the cable from a bike lock around the hook, and then around his neck, and kneeled into it. He was about 6 feet away from me, back was to me when I opened the door, and he was against the left wall, the entryway being about as wide as a standard door. I went into some sort of shock, yelled hello a few times before telling the person there to view the apartment, and walked them outside. I called my boss, and told him what happened, and he called the police for me. I then went back in. I yelled hello 2 to 3 times as I got close to him, even though at this point I could see his eyes open and lifeless. I could see his left hand tucked into the cable. I'd always wondered if that was a survival instinct or a last-minute regret. I finally touched his arm, and it was like a shotgun blast back to reality. Left the apartment. The person there for the showing stayed, and consoled me. Told me she'd found her mother in similar fashion. Then, the property manager came, and I let him into the unit so he could confirm. Shortly thereafter the cops came, and said it was evident it was suicide, and I was free to go. Friends in that building told me they'd spoke to him the night before. I've suffered with depression, and suicidal ideation for most of my life, and was on edge that year. It was pretty hard for me at the time, and I think about that man often. Also the woman that stayed behind to console me. That was the first showing of the day that day, and I ended up having to finish out my 10-hour shift. Edit. I ultimately agreed to finish the day. The apartment was off the market for 2 weeks. I was the first person back in to show it, and the first showing I entered to his family cleaning the place out. I quit real estate not too long after that. I had been to one of the villages in northeast India, and it had been raining like crazy for the past 1 week or so. The river next to the villages had overflowed, and many houses were washed away. My family was safe because our house was on a hill. During one of these days, I was looking outside the window at the flooded river below, and I saw a floating human corpse, all bloated, and covered with water hyacinths. I couldn't go near the water for almost a year after that. P.S. I am getting a lot of comments saying if the person was given a water burial. No, it was not a water burial. Also, it wasn't the river Ganges. It was the Brahmaputra River which had flooded, and it washed away houses and livestock. A lot of helpless people drowned. I had the misfortune of seeing one of them. Shows how few people actually know that lots of parts of northeast India face devastating floods everywhere, costing human lives in the hundreds. Also, water hyacinths are not beautiful flowers, they are long weedy-like plants that grow in abundance in water. And if you are not careful, and swim into them, it is difficult to detangle yourself. I was a project manager on an irrigation project to line earthen ditches with concrete in NV. It was around 2016 that we were in a sort of remote area of the state. Anyways, the construction crew I hired to excavate a portion of the ditch came across an entire skeleton. The skeletal remains were on one of the side banks of the ditch. I mean the entire skull, and ribs were visible to everyone. I had to halt all activities, and notify local PD, and the forensics crew from Reno came, and retrieved the remains and performed a sweep of the area. For about a week before we could resume our project. To be honest, it was a little creepy, and unnerving to see that in person. To my knowledge, it was a cold case from the 1960s. Reno mobsters from the casinos used to take people out to Indian reservations, and get rid of people because lack of law enforcement on reservations in those years. Found a dead body in the woods. My friend and I were doing a little road trip, and our car was having some issues, so we took it to a shop to have it looked at. It was going to be a few hours, so I suggested that we walk back in the woods a bit, and look around, maybe pick some wild berries for the drive, whatever. There wasn't a trail or anything, we just walked into the forest, and wandered around. I'm pretty good with directions, and the forest area was small, so we weren't worried about getting lost. Anyways, we're walking around in the forest for maybe 20 minutes, when we saw a pair of shoes on the forest floor next to some plastic bags which appeared to be empty. We walk over to it, and also spotted a broken pair of glasses, and an ID card that looked like someone attempted to cut in half. The ID belonged to a young woman. Needless to say, we were both concerned, but also intrigued. I continue wandering around the area, and looking around, and suddenly my friend abruptly puts his arm on my chest to stop me in my tracks, and get my attention. He looks serious, and he's staring straight ahead. I follow his gaze and see what looks like a black trash bag with hair sticking out of the top. You could see a little bit of a scalp, and a woman's brown hair sticking out. My instincts kicked in immediately, because from where we were standing it looked almost exactly like a woman's dead body had been dumped there. I remember having a god-awful feeling in my chest. My friend and I looked at each other for a second, and then we hightailed it out of there without saying a word. Once we got out of the forest, we called the cops, and told them everything. I still had the ID with me. We waited for the police to show up, and they asked us to lead them to the scene. We both really didn't want to go back up there, and I specifically told the cops I wanted more people to go with us, so we waited for more cop cars to arrive before heading into the forest. We got a little lost trying to trace back our steps, but we eventually found the shoes, and the plastic bags. We all look around the area, and my friend and I nearly had a heart attack when we realized the woman's body was gone. No plastic bag, just nothing. It had only been maybe 45 minutes since we were last there. I remember feeling the urge to run back out of the forest because the thought of a murderer being in the area or watching us freaked me the fuck out. I did my best to hold it together, but honestly I was scared shitless. The cops could see how freaked out we were, so they believed us. We showed them where the body had been, and it looked like something heavy had been dragged several feet, and then probably picked up. My friend asked if they could bring canine units or something, and they said they were already on the way. They searched the area for the rest of the day but never found anything. The forest led out onto a road, so my guess is the killer was in the area when we found the body, and after we left he picked the body back up, and carried it to his vehicle, and drove off, realizing it had been discovered. As far as I know, they never found the killer or the body, but they did find some tools by the road that looked like they were used for torture and mutilation. I don't know much else about the story, but it's scary to think about how often this kind of thing happens, and we never hear about it. My college roommate, one assigned to me, not like a longtime friend, killed himself, and I found him hanging in the closet. He was painfully shy, and even though I lived with him for 4 months, I probably only had him say 50 words to me. He seemed very introverted, and was a music major, and just always had headphones on listening or writing stuff. I played on the basketball team for the college, and was traveling for 2 to 3 days, and when I came back at like 3 a.m., I found him hanging from a belt in the closet. His one shoe had fallen off. I'm guessing he struggled a bit, which is horrifying. He left a suicide note, and blamed it on my GF, and I. She was his acquaintance that was a music major, and we met through him. I went to a recital, but neither of us knew he was completely in love with her. Once we started dating, his life became too much to bear. It was sad, but I didn't know, and never would have done it if he had said something, so I felt bad but didn't take it personally. My GF was a Swedish exchange student, and pretty much went back home in the middle of the semester like 2 days after this all happened, and I literally didn't even get to say goodbye to her. Technically didn't find the remains. The deceased was a living member of our travel group until he died. I was part of a group of exchange students in China in the mid-2000s. For the autumn festival holiday we managed to book a group travel tour in Tibet. Was difficult to do back then, you needed state sponsors. Being young and invincible, we flew from basically sea level to Lhasa, drove on a tour bus to Shigatse, then to Mount Everest base camp within 4 days. One member of our group started acting strange in the afternoon when we got to base camp, was acting really weird at night, and then was comatose in the morning, acute altitude sickness. We put him on our bus, and headed for the nearest hospital, 2+ hour drive away. Our friend died about 30 minutes into the trip. We took him off the bus to try CPR, but in hindsight that doesn't help the issue he had. Our tour guide called local police. We waited on the side of the road for them to come. After an hour and a half, one cop in a tiny little SUV shows up. He takes one look at our group, dead foreigner, better call the captain, and then decides he's going to take the body back to wherever. Unfortunately, our deceased friend was both very tall and very fat, 6'5" and 350+ pounds. He would have had trouble fitting in the tiny SUV alive. Definitely wasn't going to happen with him dead. So new plan is for us to put him back on our bus, and drive him to the closest morgue, in the hospital we were on the way to anyway. We get him back on the bus, have one of the worst bus rides in the history of bus rides for the next hour and a half, and finally wind up at a hospital in the middle of fucking nowhere, Tibet. Unfortunately for us, our deceased friend is 1. Starting to stink, and 2. Starting to experience rigor mortis. It took 6 of us just to lift our friend. He's wrapped in a blanket at this point, and we needed 2 more local police to help us get him around the bend out the bus door. Spare you all too much of the gory details, but suffice to say his body had stiffened to the point where it was a difficult corner. Once off the bus, the police and hospital staff get him on a gurney or whatever they are called, and take him away. Back then world dynamics were a bit different, and so an American dying in Tibet apparently kicked the hornet's nest of local police. A bunch of different departments and high-ranked police show up, smoking like a chimney, looking pissed off, and speaking Tibetan dialect I couldn't understand. Everyone got interviewed about what happened. Not much to say given the cause of death was altitude. Then they put our friend's body in the back of an ambulance. They had to strip the back almost bare to get him to fit, told us he was bound for the official morgue in Lhasa, and sent him on his way. We get back on the bus. Our trip is effectively over at this point, so we decide to just drive back to Lhasa as well. Unfortunately, there are limited roads in this part of the world. We were behind the ambulance carrying our friend for as long as I bothered to pay attention on what was like an 8-hour drive. I've got 2 for found body/parts. The first is straightforward, not suspicious. I was working concrete, pouring a slab for a building that would be neighboring a big hayfield. Spoke to the farmer a couple times. He told me he likes to take a break in the shade next to the pond when he's out cutting hay. A few days go by, we're nearing the end of our project. He starts cutting hay. We waved at him as we left the job site for the day. The next day we showed up, and his tractor was on its side. Me and another guy ran over, and the old man was dead underneath the tractor. Looked like he bled to death. The second time was the suspicious time. I went fishing, and caught a shoe with the foot still in it. I called the police. They came out, took my statement, cut the line, and took the foot along with one of my favorite lures. When I was 12 I was visiting my grandparents, like I often did on the weekends. They lived close to my house, so I'd go pretty often. This visit there was a loose dog in their rural neighborhood. A big droopy basset hound. I called him Puddles. I let Puddles inside the house to play with my grandparents who loved dogs. First time, my grandfather let him back outside. I was having fun, and thought it was a game, so I let the dog back inside. Shortly after letting Puddles back inside, I was outside playing. I heard a sound I'll never forget. My grandfather got tripped up by the dog, and fell down the stairs to the basement. He was likely gone before he hit the bottom of the flight of stairs. I made it to the commotion before my grandmother did. The last time I saw my grandfather, he was lying contorted in a pool of blood. I haven't been right since. I'm sorry, Pop, it was my fault. 2 people were murdered in my front yard, and a third almost bled to death on my porch. 2 guys robbed the third, and stabbed him in the neck. He shot them both dead with only 2 shots, and spurting blood out of his neck like a fountain. This was maybe 10 years ago or more now. I was a news cameraman at the time. We were doing a story about a woman who had gone missing Friday night after a night out. She was last seen outside of her house when her friend dropped her off. Cops spent the weekend canvassing the neighborhood looking for her or any evidence of a crime. They found nothing. It was a pretty sketchy neighborhood with lots of drug usage, car traffic, crime, and foot traffic off of a major street in our city. Police were pretty sure her ex-husband abducted and killed her, but couldn't prove it. Me and the reporter I was with were in the back of our news van working for hours. Not really paying attention. Sometime in the afternoon a neighbor whose lawn we were parked in front of came out, and started mowing his lawn. He was mowing, and doing yard work for maybe 40 minutes when he came, and knocked on our window. He said, "Hey, there's a junkie passed out over there under that tree. Can you walk over with me to wake them up? Sometimes when I do this they freak out, and I don't want to go alone." No biggie. We get out, and start walking toward the person. About 10 feet away the guy turns around, and he's ghost white, and my reporter says, "Call the police now." I grab my phone, and run toward the person. It's the missing woman, but she's dead. Wearing exactly the same outfit she went missing in, but her face is completely purple, eyes wide open, she's bloated, and flies are crawling in and out of her nose. So I call police, and tell the dispatcher what we found, and she wanted me to give the dead woman CPR. I refused because she had clearly been dead for days. I'm not giving mouth-to-mouth to a dead person or touching part of a crime scene. The dispatcher basically tells me if she is still alive, and I don't help, I may as well have killer her. I still refuse. I go to the van, and get my camera to document the scene. Not to broadcast, but just so there is proof of what the scene looked like before cops arrived. A legal cover-your-ass move. I shoot a few quick shots, and put my camera down, and as I'm standing up cops come screeching up, and pull their guns on me. They handcuff me, and immediately start interrogating me. It's clear they don't believe me, and are trying to put me in the back of a car until I point out the giant camera, my press badge, and the gigantic van that says local news on it. My reporter comes running up, and they recognize her, so they uncuff me, and just start asking me to tell them what happened. I was pretty shaken up, and just got a ride home after talking to police. Didn't finish my shift. The creepiest part is that it's likely someone came and dumped the body while we were in the back of our truck, and we just didn't see them. I was 11 years playing in the woods with my friends. Autumn day, bright, cool. There was 4 of us, 3 boys, and a girl. We were walking a pretty well-known path between 2 neighborhoods when the girl said, "Someone left their doll out here." We walked over to the doll, which was dressed in jean coveralls, sneakers, and a kid's jacket. She was on her side, kinda curled up, but her face was towards the ground so we could only just see one eye, one cheek, one ear. She had brown shoulder-length hair that was a bit curly like a lot of little kids' hair is. About 3 or 4 years old. The girl in our group kneeled down once, and shook her shoulder, and said, "Hey kid." Nothing. After that we all kinda looked around at one another, and one of us, don't remember who, said we should call 911. There was a payphone on the street at the end of the path in the direction we had been heading, so we all just walked away from the kid. We kept looking back until she was out of sight. I made the call when we got to the phone. I had to explain it to the person on the line 3 or 4 times before they kinda believed me. Told me they were sending out an officer. He pulled up about 5 minutes later, took one look at all our faces then said, "Where is she?" We pointed down the path, and one of the guys said you can't miss her. The cop told us to stay where we were, and he walked on down the path. 10 minutes later another squad car came screaming down the road with lights and sirens. After that the place was an absolute circus. All 4 of us kids just kinda walked away. Saw it on the news that night that it was a little girl who'd gone missing the day before from a couple of miles away. It was said she died of exposure. I think about it every now and then, and get sad, like now. Was at Bonnaroo working for the Clean Vibes crew post-show. Basically just picking up trash on the farm that the festival is held on. People are the worst though, so they would also leave behind entire tents, coolers, clothes, etc. We started things into piles for recycling, but the rule was also if you saw something you wanted you could have it. Perks of the job. People have claimed whole tents, souvenirs, and even drugs, came up on a small orange tent that was tucked away a bit into some bushes likely for shade. A guy in the group starts claiming dibs, but it smells pretty bad over there, so more power to him. Come to find out after unzipping it that there's still a person inside who has passed away. Likely from dehydration or heat stroke, as it's the case a lot of times there. Music festivals have people who die every year because they drink too much or trip too hard, and forget that they need to drink water in the Tennessee summer sun. We had to sit on a hill a few yards away while the authorities were called. One Sunday evening, me and my family were dining, and we heard a very loud noise, almost like an explosion. Our first thought was that a gas barrel has exploded, and we were very worried. Me, my mom, and my dad went outside immediately, and only then we realized what had happened. All of our neighbors had heard it too, and like us, went outside. For context, our neighbors, who were about 16 or 17, had this motorcycle, and they loved it to death. That day, one of them decided to pull a prank on the other one, so he filled the exhaust pipe of the motorcycle with matches. Then he would say something along the lines of, "Hey, I think there's something in there. Would you mind checking?" And as he would do that he would start the engine, and accelerate. That's exactly what he did. But the outcome wasn't what he thought would happen. Basically this poor guy's hand blew up, completely destroyed. There were fingers, flesh, and bones all over our street. The next day, I was coming home from school, and on my way I found another remaining finger on the sidewalk. That was disturbing. My buddy and I went rock climbing a couple years ago. We went to this crag that is rarely visited because it's a pain in the ass to get to. Anyway, we get there, and there is one car in the parking lot. We think nothing of it. We get up to the crag, and start climbing the route that we planned climbing. It's a 3-pitch route, which means 3 different belay spots. Whatever, you didn't read this far for rock climbing lessons. Anyway, I'm leading the second route, and take a break. I turn around, and way down, probably 120-ish feet maybe more, I see dude lying on the ground. I yell at him, and nothing. I tell my buddy I think there's a dead dude down there. We bail on the climb, and rappel down to him, and certainly this dude was dead. Turns out he committed suicide by jumping from the top of the cliff. But the dude landed on all this rock, and his body was pretty mangled up, and he'd been there about 4 days, so he was starting to go through decomp, and some animals had gotten to some of his extremities. When we called 911 they wanted us to go check his pulse, and shit. Search and rescue eventually came, and picked him, and it was not a pretty sight. Out jogging one morning I saw a dude on a motorcycle ram into a landscape worker on the sidewalk. I thought he must have lost control, so I run over to them, and motorcycle guy is bent over the landscaper, but when he sees me he goes to his bike, gets it running and leaves. I got it on video. Calling 911, I'm helping landscape guy, translating for him etc., pressure on wounds. Feel so bad for him. He's worried about getting fired. Give the cops my witness account, and video etc. Landscape guy paralyzed. Motorcycle guy arrested. Come to find out landscape guy raped motorcycle guy's sister. I wonder if he was going to finish him off before I ran over to them. Had I known that I would have done everything the same except give the cops the video of him fleeing. Bombing range in southwest Arizona, Berry Am Goldwater. It's a huge swath of land. Touches the southern border, and then probably 90 miles north. It's big, it's empty. Frequently used for drug trafficking. The mules have got to be some of the toughest men you could imagine. They are carrying serious weight, found bales that were at least 70 pounds each, strapped to their backs with basically baling twine. These guys are way tougher than I am, Or if we're being honest, it's a way to keep their families fed, and these are not guys making crazy good money. Anyways, it's the desert, this place is not gentle. We find remains on a semi-regular basis. Classic sun-bleached skull. Thigh bones, ribs. I've never come across one that was intact or had any flesh. They're dying from the conditions, that it's a bombing range is just scenery. We call range control, they call the sheriff's department, we get to call it a day early since it needs to be processed. I'm out there clearing targets, and blowing duds, the mules, they're doing the real dangerous work. That's duds, no I did not misspell dudes. It has happened to me twice. The first was as a teen, and my neighbor wouldn't come to the door for her ride. A neighbor and I managed to flip the window lock with a credit card, and get it open to allow me to reach around and unlock the back door. 911 had already been called, and we could hear sirens. I called out to her, and got no response. I turned down the hall, and she was laying in the floor. I felt for a pulse but didn't feel one. So I opened her front door to guide the EMTs inside to her, and watched them do their work. I found out later, despite all they did she was already dead. The second time was when my girlfriend, and I woke from a nap, and my girlfriend wasn't beside me. I thought she was probably out in the garage or on the deck. I turned the corner to the garage, and found her laying face down in the floor. I yelled her name, and ran to her. But before I could turn her over I knew something was wrong, her body was already stiff. She died having a seizure, it's called SUDEP, sudden unexpected death due to epilepsy. When I turned her over her face was frozen, and an expression of utter agony that haunts me to this day. I had no idea what had happened at the time. But I called 911, and the guy tried to talk me into doing CPR. When I explained about the rigor mortis he let it go. The EMTs took one look, and knew she was dead. Because she was so young the cops treated it like a crime scene. For hours I was questioned the same questions over, and over. My GF's brother eventually showed up, and verified she had epilepsy, and they backed off a little. But I was trying to keep my shit together while consoling her mom too. Not a good night. I'd known my neighbor since childhood, so it took me a bit to get over. I'll never be over losing the love of my lifetime. It's been years, and I still miss her every day.